everyone. Welcome to another episode of our podcast. Today, I'm joined here with Joseph, who's going to be talking about his experience in finance and tech, doing some really cool stuff. Joseph, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background, and career trajectory.
Absolutely. I want to start off firstly by thanking you for having me on, and also just to shout out your organization for all that you do. I think it's pretty incredible that you're, empowering students, refugees, immigrants, and I'm really happy to be part of this podcast. So to talk a little bit about myself, Joseph Martinez. I grew up in Markham, Ontario, and I think a good way to kind of describe myself is to describe a little bit about my family and kind of who I draw inspiration from. So my mom and sisters, they're the most compassionate and caring type of people. They really enjoy connecting and learning about people. My father, the hardest working, has got an incredible work ethic, incredibly selfless. My stepmom and my brother are the ones who really challenge me and push me to do more. And have always kind of been my academic cheerleaders, if you will. So I try to kind of draw inspiration from that and portray myself as, a combination of some of those traits. So that's a little bit about me. I guess to dive into the academic side of things, as I mentioned, I grew up in Markham, Ontario. I attended purely at Trudeau High School and their French immersion program. And after graduating, I went on to the University of Guelph. I paid my way through school and got myself a commerce degree focused on economics and finance. Through that, my post-grad, I did an exchange actually in China, in Chengdu, which is a Sichuan province. For those who aren't familiar, it's a capital in southwest China, which was an awesome experience. And yeah, so I wrapped up my undergrad at Guelph and made my way into the workforce. To talk, I guess, a little bit about my professional background, my first job and the job which I've actually held for the longest period of time was at a company called Clark Basement Systems. And so I worked every summer from grade 9 all the way through university in the waterproofing industry as a laborer. And so this was a job that my dad did, and he wanted to give me exposure to this type of like difficult labor intensive work from an early age to kind of serve as one, to build some work ethic, and two, to show me like how difficult it is to, provide a living and to work in those types of jobs. So definitely some real lessons I took away from that type of work. And it kind of drew me to, pursue my post-secondary education, to get into the workforce and to do things like that. So after I graduated, I landed a job at an organization called Fidelity Investments. I started off in their call center, which was quite an experience. I did that for a number of months, and then I got promoted into a sales team. And so I did that for about 4 years. And so I worked at their call center and worked my way up to an inside sales roles job. And my role there was essentially to serve as like a consultant or, a trusted partner to financial advisors and brokers to help build their books of business. So I spent about 4 years at Fidelity, an incredible place to work. They invest a lot in their employees. They take training very seriously. And after 4 years, I applied to Amazon. And so I've been at Amazon Web Services for about 3 years now. And now I find myself as an enterprise account manager taking care of our financial services practice.
Awesome. That sounds amazing. So I actually wanted to ask a follow-up, and I wanted to ask about the exchange you mentioned where you went to China, and if that changed your perspective on how you approach your work or your relationships going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think anyone in my group of friends and family, they know all about China because I talk about it still to this day, very, very highly. Yeah, so China was interesting because I think it took everything that I knew in maybe our typical Western culture and pretty much flipped it on its head, right? It's obviously they're vastly different countries like in North America compared to China. And so I think it opened up my mind to think that, my perceptions and the way I think about things today aren't the only ways to think about it, if that makes sense. It kind of opened up my perspective to a lot of things. Yeah, I loved my time in China. I still have like friends that I've made from down there that I keep up with, but
Oh,
I
that's
think
so
just kind of
cool.
opening up my perspective and kind of realizing like you don't know everything, and the way that you do things isn't the only way to get things done. And I think that was, maybe the biggest takeaway from that exchange.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a different culture, different traditions. So that's really cool that you were able to get exposure to that.
They also have really spicy food. Sichuan province, that was another big
Oh,
takeaway is
okay. I didn't
spice
know.
here. Yeah, it's incredible. It's like they have a Sichuan pepper. It's hot and it also like numbs your entire mouth. And so yeah, I'd
Oh,
say that's my one and two takeaways was, opening my perspective to different things, and Canadian
and
heat is different.
hopefully your spice tolerance went up.
It did. It definitely
Okay,
did.
awesome. So with the work experience you mentioned, you started at Fidelity and now you're working at Amazon. So I was actually wondering if you could talk about your transition from finance to tech and what led you to make the change and if there were any obstacles you had to overcome.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, and I'm guilty of this as well. I think when you're working in a certain industry, it's easy to kind of pigeonhole yourself and you're really caught up in your role and your industry and you're hyper focused on that. But I think it's equally as important to, be focused on what you're doing, but also have an awareness of what's happening around you. So like what's happening in the world from a technology perspective, what's happening, like from a macro perspective, what are the markets doing? And I think that's really important to kind of have that macro view on the world while you're in your career. And so after about 4 years at Fidelity, I poked my head up and I was just trying to see, like, where's the world going? We were in the midst of COVID, and so markets weren't doing so hot. And that's when I came across cloud computing and I saw some of the trajectory and how quickly it was growing. And especially during COVID, it was helping solve a lot of really interesting problems. And I wanted to align myself with that growth. And that's what led me to apply. So that's kind of how I thought about the transition. As for obstacles, there's quite a few. I think the first would be there's a learning curve, right? Like I was in a world of ETFs and mutual funds and stocks and bonds, and I'm now moving into this cloud computing space. I didn't know the first thing about cloud computing, prior to interviewing and doing my research. So I think the learning curve and kind of wrapping my head around a new technology was pretty significant. And the way that I addressed that was, after getting my foot in the door, I spent the first 6 to 8 months, like every evening, studying for a variety of certifications, like my cloud practitioner, my solutions architect associate certification. So I think that helped kind of bridge that learning gap. The second I'd say is there's a very different sales approach. Like I'm in a sales role, and there's a very different sales approach when you think about like financial sales versus cloud sales. So I think in my previous role, it was really like a pitch, sell, close, like a very transactional type of sales approach. Whereas at AWS, it's more of a long-term partnership, problem solving type of approach. And while I'm not going to argue that one approach is better than the other, I just think finance and tech have fundamentally different offerings, and so you have to adapt your sales process to that. And so that took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around, going from like a closer, if you will, to more of a how do we solve this problem? How do we work together to get there? So I think those are the two biggest obstacles that I had to overcome.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that, but now that you mention it, I'm kind of seeing like a different way you're kind of pitching and making those sales. And I feel like finance and tech are also like very different industries. So it's really incredible that you're able to take that initiative to learn on your own and get those certifications. I was wondering when you actually were thinking about making this transition, what were some of the skills you kind of emphasized in the resume or your interview to really make it known that you were ready for this change in your career?
Yeah, so I think when I was looking at the resume itself, it was a pretty entry level sales gig that I applied for. And I think it was, a lateral or even like, maybe a role that was a step down from what I was doing, because I was trying to keep in mind, like, although I'm doing this in finance, I'm not necessarily ready to do this same role in tech. And so I think it's important. I think people are always focused on, I need to get a promotion. I need to be making more money. I need to be progressing. But I think lateral moves are super, super valuable. And I was transparent in my interview. I told them, look, here's what I know about the technology. Here's how I think about it. Here's what I've understood over the last, 2 months of prep. But I think what was like arguably more important was showing them that like I like to learn. I know I don't know everything. I don't know everything about the finance world, and I'm still continuing to learn in my current field. And so I think really showing that you have that innate curiosity and that desire to learn is the biggest skill or the biggest asset that you can bring to a career transition like this.
Got it. Yeah, that's really good to know. So the next thing I wanted to ask you, Joseph, is a little bit about your current role as an enterprise account manager at AWS. So could you share a little bit about like your role, what you do, and how you work with financial service customers?
Absolutely. I think maybe the best way to start with that question is to talk about cloud computing and like what it is. I think there could be varying levels of understanding, but I think the way in which a lot of us and maybe some of the listeners are familiar with this technology is through your phone, right? Like you have your phone. If you're anything like me, you take hundreds of pictures and videos, and then
Yeah.
after a while it fills up and you're prompted, hey, do you want to store this on the cloud? And so, as a consumer, you're just, paying a subscription, and now you're in the cloud and you don't have to worry about like buying, a USB stick to store all these pictures. You don't have to worry about, is it secure? Am I going to lose it? Am I going to misplace it? So you kind of just have this technology and it just works and you don't have to worry about it. So in that same kind of like mental model, it's that same application, but with businesses. So by definition, cloud computing, it's the on-demand delivery of IT resources over the internet with the pay-as-you-go model. And so this whole idea of cloud computing really stemmed from our parent company, which is Amazon.com, who I'm sure some folks are familiar with. And it was interesting in the early 2000s, what Amazon noticed as they were growing so quickly, as they were scaling, is they had major spikes when people were going onto their website trying to buy things, like typically around the holidays. So around Christmas time, everyone's on the website. And so them as an organization, they would have to buy all this infrastructure to meet this like massive demand. The downside was January or February, when demand goes way, way down, they're still stuck with all of this infrastructure and it's super underutilized. And so that whole concept kind of birthed the idea of AWS. And we recognize that, if we're dealing with this when we're scaling, there's probably other organizations that are dealing with similar issues. And so that kind of birthed the idea of cloud computing for us at Amazon. And so that's a little bit about cloud computing. And I guess to talk about kind of what I'm doing, it's, as you mentioned, I'm working with financial service customers. And my role is essentially to find what is your biggest, most challenging problem? Like what keeps you up at night? What are you guys banging your head against the wall trying to solve for? And it's working backwards from that to build a solution to address that challenge. So we have, I think it's over like 240 services now. So, if I had my finance hat on and I was just trying to pitch services, I would be there all day trying to pitch, storage, database, generative AI. So that's not really, I think, an effective way to go about it. It's more of, okay, where are we trying to go? And then how can we use all these different services in tandem to solve for it? So that's in essence what I'm helping some of these FSI customers achieve.
Got it. That sounds really cool. And if you don't mind clarifying, could you talk about what pay-as-you-go model means?
Absolutely. It's a really good question. So you can think about the cost structure of cloud like your utility bill or like your electricity. So if I went and I turned on my lights because I need light for a period of time, I'm paying for it. And then
Yeah,
when I'm done with it, turn off the light, and then the cost stops. So it's very much whatever you need and whatever you're using, you'll pay for. But it gives you that ability that traditionally was much harder to do, like to scale back. Like you can't just go sell some of your servers or your racks that you
yeah,
had provisioned and purchased earlier. So it's exactly that. It gives you the ability to scale up, but also scale down and stop paying when you don't need to use things. That
that's
kind of makes it a unique and a helpful model. And it's one of the biggest benefits, I think, of cloud and the industry.
I imagine it saves a lot of costs too.
That's exactly it. I think it's cost and also it's not as difficult to innovate. So if you want to just go try to spin something up like, hey, I'm going to go try to build, this artificial intelligence type of application for whatever it is, you can go build it out and maybe it works, great, continue using it. You can, pay for those services and recognize that benefit. But if you don't, you just turn it off and there's no like contracts or like long-term agreements. You can quite literally just turn it off and stop paying for it and scrap it and try something new.
Yeah, so it gives you flexibility too.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, awesome. That's really cool. So I was also wondering, what would you say are some common challenges financial services client faces when transitioning to cloud technologies, and how do you kind of help them navigate these challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a number of challenges, some of which, aren't even just for financial services clients. They could just be for organizations as a whole. I think the number one is change is hard. People don't like change. There's a natural friction with change. If you're doing something for 20 years and you've always done it in a specific way, like why would you pivot? Why would you change? And so I think that's a common challenge. And so what we do as an organization and what I do as, an account manager is I'll try to find those folks within an organization that are, kind of the early adopters, if you will, or the ones that really like the technology resonates, are excited about it. And I try to empower those people with the education, with the background to try to help them grow and influence that type of modernization mentality. We also help organizations build like cloud teams. So having an internal team that's just like proficient and that can help teach and coach folks around the organization. So I think, yeah, number one challenge would be dealing with change. A second would be when you think about upskilling and repurposing some of your resources internally. Like if folks are used to operating in a certain way, as I mentioned, for 20 years, and now you're telling them to learn a totally different technology, that can be daunting. And so
Yeah.
really providing that education, that hands-on experience. It's not just here's a product, best of luck to you. I hope this succeeds. It's very much a partnership in that we want you to succeed. That's our number one priority. And I think the second would be repurposing. So if you think about an example that I've used, and I don't know if it's that good of an example, but if you're running a lemonade stand, right, and you have 3 employees, and 2 of these employees, their entire job is just to make sure like the lemonade stand itself is operational. Like, there's no loose screws, it's not going to fall over and break, and then you have one person selling the lemonade. The whole idea with cloud is now, okay, let's outsource that infrastructure so you don't have to worry about the lemonade stand falling out. And now you can repurpose those 2 other employees to go, source the best lemons that you can, do all the research on different recipes for lemonade, focus on customer experience. And so there's this whole idea of, we're not trying to say the jobs you're doing are obsolete. It's like, let's take those people that are doing what we call like undifferentiated heavy lifting and repurpose them to actually focus on what drives you as a business, what delivers value to your customers. And so it's kind of repurposing within an organization that I think is another challenge. And we work with folks to do exactly that. And the third challenge, which is more specific to FSI customers, is these people are in the business of managing money and they're inherently risk averse. You don't want to take a big bet on a technology if you don't have full confidence in that. And so when
Yeah.
I approach it, the same way an organization would evaluate a stock or a bond or a certain investment, I try to understand like what are the different pillars that are important to you when making a technology decision, whether it be security, whether it be scalability, cost. And I try to make that really, really clear so there's a good understanding so that, when you're moving into this technology, there's no surprises, there's nothing you haven't thought about already. So I think that's another challenge, and that's the way we try to address it.
Yeah, those are some really valid challenges because I imagine a lot of people, they just don't want to change. They're just used to what they're doing, but maybe this is actually has the potential to really change and make the things they do a lot easier.
100%. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
I was wondering when you are trying to work with specifically the third challenge you were talking about, where they're risk adverse, and you want to find out whether it's like security that they care about, and you really are trying to pitch it to them. Like, what are some questions that you ask to really get an assessment of what is most important to them? What are some ways that you find out like what their priorities are?
I think it's just direct questions. Like there's no beating around the bush. It's like, what about this project scares you the most? And then that's where we'll start. And there's always going to be, a focus on security. Like that's, I think, job zero is security. But I think asking like, what's holding you back from adopting new technology? Is it an internal thing? Is it, resources? Is it training? Is it, maybe a lack of understanding of the cloud and how it works? So I think it's really working backwards from what their top issues or concerns are. And then, we have a deep bench here at Amazon, and we bring in folks to walk you through security from the ground up, or walking through training programs, walking through how we can help alleviate maybe some of those concerns.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's important to have, really direct conversation. And my job is to have a real understanding at what those blockers are to try to help ease the transition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the next question I have is, in your experience, what are some key factors that financial services organizations should consider when moving to the cloud?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot for sure. I think the one and I've alluded to it earlier, the whole working backwards approach is really, really, really important here. It won't make a lot of sense to move to the cloud just to move to the cloud, just because that's what, other people are doing and you've read about it, because I think you'll miss a lot of the benefits. So I'd say the number one consideration, the number one thing you should do is have, as an organization, is have a vision. Like, what is the end state? Like, what are we trying to solve for? What is utopia for us, right? And then once you have that vision, then you can work backwards to find out, okay, so what's stopping us from getting there? Do we need training? Do we need, more better understanding on security? Do we need X, Y, and Z? So I think number one is having an outcome that you're trying to work towards. The second factor to consider, I think there's this notion that moving to the cloud is this massive, multi-year migration initiative, and it can seem daunting. And
Yeah.
while that approach is used by some organizations, I think it's important to know that you don't have to make it as big as you think it is. You can start super small. And we were talking about this earlier, where you can just try to spin something up, create a POC, see if this solves for the issue. And if it doesn't, turn it off, you're
Mm,
done, and reassess and maybe try to focus on another area. So I think having that notion that it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing type of journey, if you will. Start small, get a quick win, and if it's working, then scale up. So I think differentiating between all or nothing, between just getting your toes wet, is important
yeah.
to think about.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it because also I imagine if you're just like dipping your toes in the beginning, you're not putting everything out there and risking too much. And then if you enjoy it, you can just expand.
That's exactly it. There's low barriers to entry. It can be big or small. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. And are there any upcoming AWS services or initiatives that you're particularly excited about for the future for your clients?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. I think the one that is getting the most attention, the most buzz right now is generative AI.
Mhm.
You can't open the news or open any tech news without reading about Gen AI and some of its applications. And so, me myself, like personally, I'm fascinated by the technology and some of the interesting use cases that it's being applied to. Like you have healthcare organizations using this technology to help develop vaccines, right? You have banks using this technology to protect some of its users from fraud or improving the customer experience. And the technology can even be used by like somebody like you or I. Like for me personally, I have no coding or IT background per se,
Same.
but with this technology, I can go and build a full scale application with little to zero coding involved. So I think it's really interesting, the different use cases that it can be applied to. But what I think is arguably even more interesting than that, or more impactful than that, and this is an initiative that we're working here at AWS on every single day, it's the democratization of this type of technology. So it's giving access of this technology to everyone.
Mm,
So that folks in maybe in underrepresented areas or people that traditionally didn't have access or have the resources to access this type of technology, that cost is going way, way, way down. And I think the more people that can access this technology, the further we'll go as a society, the better, the bigger problems we'll be able to solve for. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's helping foster this real culture of innovation across societies that might have been a little bit more difficult, years past when the technology was quite expensive.
yeah, I think Gen AI is really changing the way we do things. And I personally use it to aid my everyday life, and it's so helpful.
100%. And yeah, everybody can access it. And so, from if you want to write a paper, you can write a paper with the help of Gen
Yeah.
AI, or you can also do things that are super complex. So I think the technology, it's still in its infancy right now, but I think we're already seeing some of its impacts. And yeah, I'm excited to see in 5 years from now, like what can we build, what can we solve for that might not have been possible before the technology was here.
Yeah, yeah, same for me. So, for a lot of the listeners here, they're recent graduates or immigrants or young students wanting to enter the workforce. So, what advice do you have for those interested in a career in account management within the cloud computing industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I can break this down into a couple parts. So with account management or sales, I think there's this notion that you have to be, a type A, super extroverted person to succeed, which isn't the case. And I've seen a ton of people be incredibly successful without necessarily being that type of person. I think you need to be someone who enjoys working with people, who enjoys solving problems and serving as a partner to individuals, working with a lot of internal and external stakeholders. And so I think it can be an incredibly rewarding field and an incredibly rewarding role. But I think you have to talk about some of the potential downfalls in sales as well. Like if there are, targets that you have to hit, and that can often, have associated stresses. There's often a variable compensation component. And so being
Mm,
able to kind of stomach the ups and downs and being able to plan for that is important. But I think, yeah, I think if you have, that drive and you have that desire to work and help people, sales can be a great place for you. As for, getting into the cloud computing industry, I think naturally, a passion for technology is really, really important. And arguably even more important is, the desire to learn. Because something that you learn or I might learn, in the field today could be obsolete in, a month or like a weeks or even days from now. So I think, having that passion and that desire to continue to learn is really, really important. And I mean, you mentioned if you're a student or you're a new immigrant or you're a professional that's just looking to get into the workforce, I'd say that, and this is, I feel it's a cliche, everybody talks about it, but I'd say your network is so important. Like,
Mhm.
get outside of your comfort zone, talk to people that you wouldn't typically talk to. And I think when you're having these discussions, it's really important to kind of share, like, what are your aspirations, what are your goals, what are you trying to do? Because when you're talking to someone, you're not just talking to that individual, you're talking to them and their entire network. And you never know that it could be one conversation could, lead to you breaking into an industry that you're really passionate about. So I'd say talk to people, build your network, and put yourself outside of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I also feel like when you talk about your aspirations, they can also help you figure out how to reach that goal because maybe
100%.
it's like a completely different path than you thought.
Yeah, and if they can't, maybe they know someone, and that, I think people, it's really awesome. It's like people have this desire to be problem solvers, right? And it's the same way that sometimes if my mom or my girlfriend or my sister they're venting to me about something, I know I'm supposed to listen to them and vent with them. But in my head, I'm like, okay, how do we solve for that? So in the same way, if you're telling someone, hey, I really want to do X, like it's like a natural like, human ability to say, okay, how do I solve for that? Do I know someone in this industry? Who can I connect them with? Is there a bit of, advice that I might be able to give? So yeah, I think sharing and being open with where you want to go and what your goals are is really, really important when meeting and talking with different people.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what would you say makes a successful account manager, or what are some key traits or skills to really succeed in the role?
Yeah, I think you have to be driven. You can't just show up and, hope for the best. So I think you really have to have that drive. I used to say you have to be really competitive, and I think that was maybe my previous role, but I can't think how else to put it. But I think you really have to be driven to succeed. Like, you drive your career, you own your patch, you own your customer relationships. You can do as much or as little as you want. And so those that really want to do more are the ones that typically perform better. So I think having that, and as I mentioned, enjoying dealing with people, building trust, developing relationships, and problem solving would be some other important traits too.
Yeah, awesome. That's great to know. So, to conclude and wrap this up, what advice would you share with your younger self that might be helpful for our listeners to hear?
Yeah, I think as I alluded to earlier, like building the network is really, really important. I think something else, not only like professionally, but like just from a personal perspective, is understand what motivates people. Like, understand what makes your boss look really good, or understand how some of your peers are measured. Because I think if you have that, awareness that, okay, so they need X, Y, and Z, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to, achieve your own goals because you know what's going to drive their behavior. So I think it's important to listen. So I think that's two really important points. Another would be to learn as much as you can. And I would love to tell my earlier self to pay more attention in high school, take as much as you can through
Mm.
university, and don't stop, after high school or university. Like, learn on your own. I think YouTube videos, the internet has a ton of resources that you can delve into. So I think keep learning as much as you can. And I think the last point would be not to take things too seriously. Don't take your work too seriously. Don't take, your career too seriously. Like, it seems like when we're in it, that project or that deal that you're working on is the most important thing in the world. But, you're going to look back, I think, in a couple of years, and I've been given this advice a lot lately. You're going to look back and that project's not going to matter at all. What's going to be important? Yeah, exactly. Right.
Mhm.
I think what's going to be important is like the relationships that you've built, the people that you surrounded yourself with, the impact that you've had. So I think, yeah, I think focus on your own like happiness and focus on, your values and what's important to you. And I think the rest will fall into place.
Yeah, those are some amazing tips that I think are super helpful. So, thank you so much, Joseph, for coming on this podcast and speaking to us. It was great learning more about your career experience from Fidelity to Amazon Web Services, your role as an account manager, and how you work with different clients. So, thank you so much, and hope everyone listening also learned a lot.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate how you having me on.
Yeah, thank you.